Welcome to the Binge Thinker podcast.
I'm Jay.
And I'm Sam.
The two of us enjoy meeting up to discuss the things that interest us.
We'll be focusing on topics concerning science, philosophy, culture and politics.
And we hope you find this discussion as interesting as we do. In the episode today, we delve into the nature versus nurture debate.
We briefly outline the debate before diving into some examples from psychology, including addiction and animal behaviour. Okay, so today we're talking about the nature-nurture debate. It's a massive topic, loads to talk about. So really, we're looking at this in there's so many different areas you can take this debate. But really, our focus is on psychology. From our education, there was a focus on the big debates within psychology, and one of the main ones, one of the popular ones that a lot of people know about is the nature-nurture debate. Just to describe it generally before we dive in, it's the idea humans are complex creatures, and you have to ask how much of our personalities, our behaviours, all of these different elements to being human, how much of it comes from our genetics that's passed down to us, and how much of it comes from our day-to-day experience. There are purist positions you can take on this. You can either say, much of our behaviour comes from our genetics, and that some things about humans are predetermined before birth or before exposure to certain inputs.
Yeah. And
then there's the other extreme, which has been popular throughout psychology history.
But as is almost always the case when there's this kind of dichotomous nature of a debate, like if you take in the extreme, you cannot be right in all circumstances.
It's almost always wrong. Yeah,
it's pretty much certain that it's always a combination of these two things.
Yeah. So just going into that, is the idea that literally everything about human behavior is learned. So that's the other extreme. That's the nurture extreme, where you're a blank slate at birth, and you go on to take everything from your environment. And as we're going to explore, there are problems with taking that extreme, and like you say, it's almost always a compromise, and you'll tend to find, just take a step back in psychology generally, just how this fits into the big picture. You're right. You would find, I remember when studying it, there is really almost never a simple answer. No. You find you'll see some studies that indicate one thing, and you think, okay, yeah, so we're finally starting to find firm ground on this topic, right? It all makes sense.
Yeah.
And then some evidence to the contrary pops up.
It's the black swan hypothesis, isn't it?
Yes.
You go your whole life thinking there's only white swans, and it only takes one to disprove that whole idea.
Exactly. So then you have to completely readjust where you come from. Yeah. So that's why this debate is so interesting, I think.
Yeah.
Because the answer to it, if there is, there is an answer, but it's probably not simple, but the answer's bound to be complex, and
but there is advantage to starting on the extremes though and working it. I think it gives you a bit more of a understanding.
I agree with that, because it you can draw the lines and show what, because it is the case actually that, although we are talking about psychology, if we're kind of broadening it out to anything that fits under the umbrella of nature nurtures, there are some things that fit on the extremes. So, for example, inherited diseases, that sort of thing. Yeah. Like, what's an example of that?
It's quite hard to change what genes you were given by deciding I'm going to go to the gym twice a week.
Yeah, so can you think of an example of a genetic? Is it Huntington's?
Huntington's disorder. Yeah.
So I think if you have that, then you've got it. It doesn't matter. So that's nature in play. But of course, that's simplifying it.
Down syndrome, and there's quite a lot of other examples.
Yeah, so that's.
But the interesting thing is, we're saying they're obviously completely caused by biological genetic variation. They obviously have psychological side effects, which can be managed and affected. So even on the extremes, when we know the cause is entirely one way or the other, we know further treatment and usage.
But these are fairly isolated cases with regard to nature nurture, and I think in the mainstay under the, if you're talking about nature nurture generally, when you're talking about it with regard to personality and traits and behavior, I think you have to look at it as a mix of the two. So if you were to make a case for each, like we say with the extremes, there's plenty of evidence for the case for nature.
Yeah.
So if we make a case for nature, there are definitely some things that we know are inherited through genetics that manifest as behavior. A good example, I think, is reflexes.
Yeah.
So there are, assuming the child is healthy, there's a series of reflexes that you will find in children. Some of them are, if you put your finger in the palm of a baby's hand, it will grasp.
It's supposed to grasp it, isn't it?
It will grasp at it. You've also got the Babinski Reflex, one that I learned about at uni.
Yeah, it's one I've not actually heard of until today. It's quite an interesting one.
Yeah, so it's to do with if you stroke the sole of the foot, the big toe bends backwards, and this is the kind of thing you would expect to see in a healthy baby. There's a few of them.
Yeah.
Here's a really interesting one as well. The step reflex in babies. If you actually hold them upright in like a walking position, the baby will essentially attempt to walk.
There's also a very, very similar one with dogs, where if you hold them above water, they automatically start paddling.
Yeah. So these are examples of, if you're using the case for nature, these are things passed down. Like, you never had the chance to learn this.
Yeah, which makes sense, because I'm thinking about when you're born in the wild. Gazelles and giraffes, and sort of a perfect example, they don't have time to learn how to walk.
No.
They need to get up pretty damn quickly, start running away from lions. And
I mean that's a good way to take this. If you're talking about things from, if you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, and survivability and the chances of being able to live long enough to pass on your genes, it really does make sense to embed a set of code into the human brain that gives it that slight edge, that likelihood of being able to survive longer, and the infants that possess that information are the ones that are more likely to survive and grow.
It's kind of like the more knowledge you start off with, the less distance you have to run to get to a certain point after.
I mean, humans are an interesting example of that. Like, they're always kind of contrasted to, like you say, gazelles or giraffes or horses or whatever. Like, what is it? Is it precocial? I can't remember the words now. I'm gonna have to look into this. I remember when learning about it. There's like, I think precocial is where you are almost ready to get out there and do what you do from a very young age. So like a foal, a young horse would be a great example of that. Literally falls out of its mother and it essentially walks off.
Whereas of course we're the exact opposite. We're born essentially premature. Just a useless little blob for up to a few years. I mean, even 18, 20 years.
Well, exactly. I mean, before you're completely self-sufficient. But it's like they're actually used as contrasting. I suppose. I mean, that's pretty interesting topic in itself. Like, why are humans so helpless?
I think we'll get onto that a bit later on. But obviously, I say we, in evolution, our species has favoured longer gestation periods to develop our incredible brain over the ability to
standout
walk.
Brain in the animal kingdom, in terms of size to relative size to body mass. That sort of thing.
If you've ever seen like a newborn baby, it's crazy how large the head is compared to the rest of its body. It's like,
that's essentially our evolutionary niche, isn't it? Our intelligence, our ability to manipulate our environment to our ends. So kind of drawing it all back in, it's we have that. You would expect that humans would be endowed with certain reflexes and traits or characteristics that kind of show through at a young age before learning. Because the kind of the humans that did have this would be more successful, more likely to reproduce. So I mean, this, where it gets interesting is you have to ask how much of our behavior is embedded. So I mean, that's kind of the basic outline of what we're talking about. But yeah, so you've got the reflexes. Another one that I didn't mention is the rooting reflex, which is where a child will essentially look for its mother's breast, trying. I mean, that's probably the best example for adaptive. I mean, obviously the baby doesn't get food, doesn't get the nourishment of the mother's milk, then you're in serious trouble as a baby.
Obviously, that's quite a basic introduction to the case for nature. with the basic reflexes of how we actually move and like how we can go about normal things, but it doesn't necessarily say a whole lot in and of its own about the case for nature in terms of psychology.
No.
What underlies the genetics of how we think, why we think that way, how we have the faculties to be able to think that way. But as we'll go on to discuss, there are maybe a few key underpinnings.
So I mean, that really the purpose of this point here is just to outline, just to give an idea of what the case for nurture looks like. So just to quickly cover the other side of it before we dive into the actual debate in its depth, is the case for nurture. And if you're familiar with psychology, or even if you're not, it's that famous, to be fair. There's a fairly famous quote by John B. Watson, who's a behaviorist, which is an area, a belief structure, if you like, within a paradigm. Yeah, I think that's the best way to put it. A paradigm within the discipline of psychology, a way of interpreting phenomena within psychology that claims that really we are blank slates, as in we essentially come into this world with nothing, and we go about learning everything, all elements of behavior. So right down to the kind of what you end up doing as a career and what you become good at. So let's say you become, the argument is that if you end up being good at writing or good at speaking, there was no inherent basis to that. Rather, it was all learned.
It's because your tabula rasa, your blank slate,
exactly,
has been written on.
Yeah. So the quote is by John B. Watson is, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggarman and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. I'm going beyond my facts, and I admit it, but so have the advocates of the contrary, and they've been doing it for many thousands of years."
Which is a really interesting angle to take, isn't it? Like the idea that it does not matter what your genetic makeup is at all, where you were born, or anything, as long as I can control every facet of your life, I can make you what I want you to.
I mean, it's the ultimate unethical experiment, isn't it? Like, we were talking about the ethics of science in a previous podcast, and this is one of the ones that's worth talking about.
It'd be a study you'd really like to do.
So,
but,
I mean, if you're never going to get it approved by an ethics,
and rightly so,
and rightly so. But I mean, the idea that you could actually take a child from its mother, from its parents, and I mean, put it in a perfectly blank white room and just control every element that you give to it, and exactly how much, and
Truman Show kind of
exactly. So
atmosphere.
Then you could try and work out. So you're isolating its environment, so you can control every single input. I mean, it's really unethical.
Is this the same psychologist who did the experiment with I can't remember what it's called, with the white rabbit?
Do you mean Little Albert?
Little Albert, that's it.
Yeah.
It essentially took a small child and a white rabbit, an object that's like usually quite associated as being cuddly and fluffy and lovely to touch, and something kids would probably quite often be very happy to be around and want to pet and play with. I can't remember the exact procedure, but essentially the child was conditioned to be fearful of the rabbit, probably by, I don't know, squirting the child or something.
It was Watson.
Watson.
It's
the same guy.
It was the same guy.
And the end result, obviously, was that the kid was absolutely petrified of rabbits, had a genuine psychological phobia of them.
If you're a behaviourist and you're coming down from the case for nurture, then you could understand why that position was so well believed in psychology. Because if you can give somebody a phobia that they didn't have before, you can embed something within somebody's psyche so strongly that they viscerally, bodily react to something, then that's a pretty strong case that environment has, a really mighty grasp over the human experience, right? So you can see why, even though now we tend to, generally I think the scientific consensus is that there's a mix between the two, like we said earlier about the extremes are not particularly popular in this area, but you can't criticize them too heavily, because I can see where they were coming from with that Little Albert experiment. You can see how you can kind of condition as you know, when things like classical and operant conditioning were being discovered, you could understand how these scientists thought that they were onto something.
Yeah, and obviously they were following the paradigm of the behaviorist approach at the time, but it's not to diminish how complex of a task that is from a purely biological perspective of the rabbit, identifying it, location of it, perceiving it as a threat, and just seeking comfort from trying to get away from it. If all of those things were completely keyed down to a biological thing, that would be it would seemingly be impossible to change through behavioral experimentation. Yeah, so I think that's really interesting, but there's another whole aspect of psychological view of it, the nurture idea, is we're all born into culture, and in my opinion, culture is one of the most important products humans have ever made. It's essentially a psychosocial form of inherited values and beliefs, in the same way that genetic material can give us brown hair and give us reflexes that teach us how to walk and stuff. Culture basically lands us in this sauce pot of ideas that have been developing for tens of thousands of years, which we then can associate with and pick up ideas from. And there's some psychological studies to do. There's social learning theory and stuff quite clearly.
Well, it's interesting you should say that about like humans and culture. Like, I remember doing a course on evolution of behavior. No, it was evolution of language, and the point of the course was to look at how humans differ from other non-human primates or other animals.
In terms of their language.
In terms of language, but why? Well, language was one of the ideas, but we're also more generally looking about what is it that make humans human? What makes us? What puts us apart? Why? Because we're such social animals. We have culture, like you say, and one of the points that was quite heavily focused on was culture. Culture is such a complex thing, but it's fairly unique in the animal kingdom. Yeah, like the fact that we have what was called a ratchet effect, which is where, like, how a ratchet, like it grabs and then moves on, and then grabs and then moves on,
builds upon.
It's exactly. So it's the idea that culture for us is unique, and it's afforded us so much progress because we can take the culture of the time. So we don't have to start when you get a baby animal. It starts at the beginning, and it has its instincts. Yeah. But it will go through its life and learn from its mistakes as it goes on. Yeah. But with humans, we can take that it's nurture in the debate. We take that environmental information, and it's externalized into books, and now it's on the internet, all that sort of thing. And as culture, we can, instead of starting off with nothing, we can start off on standing on top of the sum total of knowledge of
litany of
all
ideas.
The humans that have come before. Yeah. And obviously, in any debate about how the effect of nature and nurture on human psychology, culture has to focus to feature pretty strongly in that, and it obviously has an effect. So I think we covered the nurture in terms of just giving some ideas of how that side of the debate looks like.
Okay, so now that we've talked about the basics of nature versus nurture and the different arguments for it from a very primary perspective, what I find more interesting, what we kind of alluded to at the beginning, is how in practice, in real world examples, these two debates obviously combine very, very often. It's almost impossible for them to be solely one or the other. And related to just what we were just talking about, actually, about children and culture and animals all together in one example, there's this really famous example in biology and in psychology of a guy called Konrad Lorenz.
Yeah.
Who's I think he was a biologist primarily. Oh no, he was a zoologist, sorry.
Right.
And he was as part of his job, he got a goose, and I think the goose died, and he was looking after all the goslings and stuff, the gosling eggs. He looked after them while they were still in the eggs, and they hatched. And over a period of like a year or so after they'd hatched, he found a really interesting thing, that they looked to him rather than other geese. Sorry for the cat. So essentially the geese had been following around for years, and a year or so, and he realised they looked to him almost as their mother, and didn't really associate with other geese or anything, and it kind of spiraled out and developed into this idea called imprinting. One of the reflexes of goslings, it turns out, is pretty much the first thing they see, they imprint on as a family member.
Yeah, because that works as a general rule of thumb. Like, in almost every case, I mean, you can, like, Lorenz exploited it, but in almost every case in nature, the first kind of animate being they would be exposed to would be their mother, in over 99% of the cases. So it's a pretty good rule of thumb, and it would work almost all the time.
Probably all seen dog looking after kittens, or like even strange things like a monkey looking after tiger cubs and stuff.
Well, that's to do with like maternal instinct as well, isn't it?
Well, that's interesting though, because that's maybe a strange one, because maternal instinct is probably biologically underpinned, but it's a psychological behavior, isn't it? It's a thing people anthropomorphizing maybe a little bit here, but it's usually like an active role. It's not like the fight or flight response where something in the environment happens which obviously isn't biological to you, but you have a biological response and go, whoa, get out of there. It's a prolonged kind of, okay, so I've got to go find food for this organism, bring it back, protect the nest and stuff. There was I can't remember if it was blue jays. I'll find the link to the video I was watching and put it in the description, but it was a really interesting video about how birds can have like meta behavior and an awareness of other creatures and stuff, and this kind of psychological forethought planning in animals that we previously thought were way below us in terms of consciousness.
But I mean, this is where it gets kind of
muddy a little bit.
It is, because I mean, if you're talking about, it's hard to separate whether or not these behaviors are learned. I mean, when we're talking about the maternal instinct, I've seen my cats, the one that literally the cat that just came in now, had 2 litters of kittens, and it's true to say that cat was never shown how to be a mother, as such. But I was gonna, but yet she was very successful at it. She knew exactly what to do. She knew to pick the kitten up by the scruff of the neck. She knew to, well, she had this kind of urge to constantly groom them. And something really interesting that they do as well is they periodically, I don't know if you know about this, periodically the mother cat will actually pick up the kittens and move them elsewhere.
By the scruff of the neck.
Exactly. So we had a pen, like a kind of collapsible pen thing that like zips up and keeps them all in one place, and then the mother can hop in and out of the top. And we kept having to, like, we would come back home one day, find the pen empty, and then
just move them all.
And we would come upstairs and like down the side of the wardrobe or behind a chair in one of the rooms or something like that, we would find them all tucked up together, and we would have to go in, pick them all up and put them back downstairs again. But what's fascinating about that on the nature nurture debate is like, there's this, what's like you say about it being complex behavior. It's not just reactive. It's not just like, danger in the environment, react. It's like, it's reasoned behavior, but it's not learned behavior.
No, so it's clearly based, in this particular example, there's clearly like an instinct base for it. And I would go along with completely agreeing in what you said there, but I actually have a counter analogy, very, very similar, but the opposite side. When I was living in an old house I used to live in, we found a kitten just abandoned like behind the shed. So we're like, okay, cool, we've got animals, we'll take it in and stuff. So that kitten grew out without a mum. I didn't get picked up, didn't get moved around, didn't get any of the primary kind of socialization that you would expect between a mum cat and a kitten cat, which potentially is where a lot of these things might come from if they're not purely instinctual. Interestingly enough, when she had kittens, she completely ignored them, just left them. We had to like bottle feed them and everything.
Seriously?
Because the suggestion there being that although there might be an instinctual origin to some of these ideas, if they're not, maybe it's more to do with learning.
But what that suggests is that the kittens learn how to be a mother from being mothers, mothered. Sorry.
Yeah.
So in the process of,
well, could it not?
Have you ever seen these kittens? I find it hard to believe, because if you look at these kittens, they're essentially they're about the size of a hamster, and I'm not a animal behavior, I'm not a behavior expert for animals, but I find it hard to believe that these tiny little kittens that are barely even conscious, they're basically like little wriggling balls of fur. I find it hard to believe that they're learning how to carry out motherly behaviors at that age.
Firstly, it's important to say that these were just analogies; these aren't studies. But and obviously, in my case, being abandoned as a kid is not just the absence of motherly care. It's probably quite a traumatic experience as well.
I mean, I realised there's a perfect way to bring this back into humans.
Yeah,
is that we know that there are examples of studies where if human children or human infants are deprived of motherly or primary socialization and care in the earliest years of their life, then they grow up with pretty serious issues and deficits, especially in the social side of things.
Yeah.
So that is a case for nurture.
Yeah. I guess.
Well, it is, isn't it? Because if you're talking about like there is Genie, for example.
Yeah.
Just pull that one out. Again, another example from psychology. It's pretty much what we're focused on. Is this child who was kept? Was she like strapped to a potty or something like that?
Essentially, she was. Her parents had her, and she showed signs of some kind of mental illness. It wasn't actually proved. Like, it's quite hard to prove retroactively if there were any kind of signs there or whatever. But the parents believed that she had some kind of mental illness,
and she was deprived of, like a normal child's upbringing. So there was very little warmth or communication. And I mean, this one is generally used to. I mean, at the moment I'm using it to talk about attachment, and how, if there's no good quality, if there's no good quality relationship between the mother and or the father, the caregiver and the child, then you lose something. Yeah, you lose a healthy social
obviously, I mean, Genie's a bit of a case study, and there's lots of areas involving are super interesting. But one of the most commonly talked about ones are in the field of language development. When Genie was finally like rescued, and she got taken to like a care home rehabilitation thing, they found that she couldn't speak at all. Like she couldn't even utter basic phrases.
Wasn't it grammar that?
No, well, that was eventually.
I seem to remember that one of the main teaching points was that there is a sensitive window for grammar acquisition, and if you miss that, so if you get.
So I was going to go on to say that, but originally she couldn't really say anything. Then she learned a few words from people around her, but then what they noticed was that she couldn't form grammatical sentences. She would say things like "door out now." Like, she wouldn't say, "I want to go out of the door."
Yeah, exactly.
Like, it was a very like broken kind of.
So I mean, this is a really fascinating point with regard to the whole debate and the whole podcast. Like, you start to see how complex it becomes, because if you follow Noam Chomsky's position that there is an innate ability to an innate language ability.
Yeah.
Which, you can see where his position comes from. Is, your language is universal among humans, so it makes sense to suggest.
Well, he also went as far to say it is amongst animals as well. It's just lacking the critical factor, which is grammar. That's what separates human language and animal language, in his opinion.
But this is where a point on the debate that's worth making, and we can apply to other things. This is where it makes sense to put it in. Is the idea that you've, as well as having things that are just purely genetic and things that are just purely environmental, you have like a predisposition for something, and so it's an interaction between nature and nurture. You've got a predisposition for something, and then something in your nurture has to attend to that predisposition correctly in order for it to form. So, like, just bringing it back to the Genie example, even though she was able to acquire very basic language, again, we'll put links to this stuff, and so that you can look into it in more detail. But even though, yes, she was able to learn, I think, probably nouns, like you say, like objects and things like that, but the argument is that if you look at it from the nature-nurture perspective, the argument is that you have that nature equips you with a language center, but you rely on nurture to bring that language center into functional
for a nice
use.
For a nice analogy, it's like having a PC but with no software installed.
Yeah,
exactly. Amazing hardware, but unless you get a program, you're never going to be able to watch YouTube. You need Windows and Chrome and all that kind of stuff to be able to get to it. So Jeannie would be a perfect case for that, where obviously she was born with language centers in her brain, but they were just never stimulated, never driven to develop. And to be fair, in a way, she kind of never needed to use them because language would never got her anywhere. But when she got into a more social situation, was then obviously we find out they can't get to the same level.
So this is where the two positions start to meet and merge. The idea of nature giving you the basic tools, and then you need to be exposed to it, to certain environmental cues, in order for it to develop. And there are other examples that fit quite neatly into that idea.
Yeah, to a different degree, rather than developing and being a positive force, there are some potential examples that have been hypothesized where a predisposition genetically can be triggered by a environmental or circumstantial event that happens. One example we learned while we're in school was a hypothesis to do with schizophrenia. It was to do with dopamine. There's been a thing that's very clearly linked to schizophrenia. Won't directly get into whether dopamine causes or is a cause of schizophrenia. However, there was a particular gene that was related to this idea, in that dopamine was hitting more receptors, or it was not hitting the receptors as well.
Which way around it is.
I can't remember which way around it was. We can check that out later. But it was called the Drd4 gene, and essentially, a variant of the gene, and essentially that gene, once affected, people with that different genotype were far more susceptible to schizophrenia. And the extra thing they found on top of that was people who suffered an extreme amount of stress were incredibly likely compared to the general population. General population of schizophrenia, I think, is about 1%.
We can definitely find that stat.
Yeah, I have to do a bit of fact checking on that maybe. But
we'll make sure we'll put it in the description. But that fits nicely into what we were saying about the interplay between nature and nurture. Is that we talked about it in a positive sense to do with the developing of language, but in the negative sense in terms of developing illnesses. I'm not certain if it's the absolute scientific consensus, but it was a pretty strong finding. The idea that you can have a predisposition for an illness, and I mean this kind of forks out into all different directions of ideas. But so the idea is that you're born with a susceptibility to an illness, in this case schizophrenia, and then what happens during your life kind of flicks the switch. It pulls the trigger. And interestingly, I mean, it's difficult to test because it's a hypothetical. But the idea would be that if you hadn't have experienced that stress in your life, you never would have got it. So it's difficult to say. That's
one of the problems with the model, isn't it? If it requires a certain thing to happen, how do you test that for people it hasn't happened to?
Well, you can't, can you?
Yeah, because exactly. You're trying to prove a negative, I think.
How would you know that the people you're testing that don't have it will eventually have it?
I saw an advert a little while ago. If you use this every single day, you won't lose your hair. I was like, well, what if I don't use it every single day and don't lose my hair? How can you prove to me that it's a worthwhile thing?
That's a logical nightmare, really, because it's like, so if you use it every day and what if you were never going to lose your hair anyway?
Exactly, that's the point. Yeah. So these things become very, very hard to test, but from a theoretical perspective, they're quite interesting. And to be honest, schizophrenia is not necessarily the only one as well. Like there's been a kind of a big push in charities and psychological research and stuff for better care of people with PTSD, which we've seen some preliminary research that it has stuff to do with the amygdala, and we know there is a natural component as at least there to be broken.
You're saying that point is that not everyone gets PTSD.
Yeah, so what I was going to go on to say, so the diathesis for this would be a traumatic event, such as going to war or so.
Yeah, but not everybody not everybody who experiences traumatic events develops PTSD. So you have to ask yourself,
is there a genetic vulnerability there in the first place that opens you
and
up?
the more you look at this, really, you start to see this in all sorts of different places. Like another place that we can go with this is addiction.
Yeah. So
a massive topic, probably deserving of its own podcast, frankly. So, you know, one of the big questions in, you know, we can use alcoholism, but you could use any sort of narcotic, really. But alcohol's used in these kind of conversations because everybody drinks just about. I think it's at over 90%, and that's a US statistic.
And if you're the small minority who doesn't, you definitely know someone who does.
The question that tends to come up in these conversations regarding alcohol is, why is it that some people become alcoholics and not others? So it's not exactly the same exposure, but a lot of people grow up with a similar exposure to alcohol. They see their parents drinking it. They see it in adverts, in films. They hear about it on the radio. It's talked about in music. You know, there's plenty of, you know, rap music, all that sort of thing, popular music, where it's talking about drinking. You know, the culture is saturated with it. And all I'm saying this to illustrate is the fact that it seems pretty much that most people growing up will have a large exposure to alcohol, including seeing people that they love and admire drinking it.
Whereas a relative few amount of people actually develop
I can't remember what the exact. I think
it is one of the more prevalent addictions in society.
I want to say
that's obviously because it's more prevalent.
Is it as high as a fifth? Is it as high as a fifth of people?
I don't know.
I'll have to look into that, but that's what I'm pulling off the top of my head for now. But obviously, I'll correct that.
Cigarettes.
Yeah. So the question is, why is it that some people tend to have a serious problem with it, where it affects their life, it ruins their life, and they can't get away from it? And even when being told by people that they love, you know, they've got their loved ones crying, saying they need to stop, it's really important, and their doctors telling them if they carry on drinking, you're going to die, and all this sort of thing, and it's robbing them of their financial, you know, their marriage, their job, and all this sort of thing. You couldn't be clearer to them that they have to stop, and yet they carry on. And it just seems like an odd kind of pattern that when most people are exposed to it, only some people, a relatively small amount of people, seem to develop this thing. So going back to nature nurture, if there was absolutely no, it would be difficult to explain why some people have the problem and others don't, if you think that everybody starts out on a level playing field, in terms of there are no genetic influences. If it's only because you would have to explain why alcoholism develops purely socially and environmentally.
But I think there is an argument to that as well, though.
I'm not ruling it out.
No. But so the usual argument is there can be, or maybe, some biological predisposition, and then there's some social factors that go towards it from a blank slate perspective. And just moving on from alcoholism for a second, although it's a good one to go back to if we want to talk about the biology of it, because it's a fairly well known and fairly well understood one. A really interesting kind of blank slate hypothesis for for like environmental exposure to a drug that then doesn't translate back home, so clearly can't be purely biological, is in the Vietnam War. With opiate use. That is like I'm sure most people listening will know it and probably pick me up for getting any bits of it wrong, but essentially the absolute travesty that was the Vietnam War. Lots of soldiers started recreationally to take the drugs from their medicine bags as just a way to kind of escape the horror of the situation for a few hours or whatever. And on the return,
could they not get hold of? I mean, were they not able to? It wasn't just from the medicine.
No,
bags.
It wasn't just. They can buy some as well. But to be fair, the stuff that they had in their medicine bags was a lot stronger and cleaner. So anyway, on the return, I think was it President Nixon at the time?
That sounds right. I think
so. So an inquiry. Obviously, this was well known. People had heard about this because it had been reported, like either on the streets or that things were going missing from medical supplies. There was this real scare that all these soldiers are going to come back as deadbeat heroin addicts and just be lying on the streets and stuff. And There was a few like interventions and stuff that may have played a bit of a role, but the long story short is essentially once taken out of that environment, that hellish jungle environment where they're constantly under fire, not understanding what's going to go on, eventually not necessarily even wanting to be there anymore, feeling like they've been in there for the wrong reasons, most of them drop the heroin, completely cold turkey. There's probably a few accounts of like the struggles of going through that, but essentially the uptake into rehab and the crime on the streets from returning veterans using heroin was incredibly low, far lower than expected.
So you're actually making a case for the environmental influence on drug addiction over biological. Okay, so you've made a pretty good case for the role of environment in addiction. The role of your environment in developing addictions and potentially being able to shift them as well. But equally as important, if we're talking about this debate, is talking about the biological element for it, which I alluded to when we were talking about predispositions. And with alcohol, something that I read, which is really interesting, which again it goes some of the way to explaining why some people react this way to alcohol and others don't, is that impulsivity is a factor in alcoholism. I think I watched a lecture on it.
All right, I've not heard of this.
So it's all right. Okay, so I'll find it and put it in. Probably something that's worth watching.
Yeah, it sounds good.
And it's the idea that something as kind of that's much more fundamental to human behavior, like alcoholism is a complex human behavior. It has lots of different behaviors involved within it. But if you can, it's reductive. But if you can reduce alcoholism down to impulsivity, as opposed to being able to control impulses. So if, for example, alcohol gives you a pleasurable feeling, which you don't have to be an alcoholic to find drinking alcohol pleasurable. A lot of people enjoy the feeling of being drunk. But if you then pursue that feeling of being drunk on impulse, and by nature, if you like, by biological predisposition, you have a higher, or I should say a lower level of impulse control, then that could go some of the way to explaining why before you even touch alcohol,
you may have a factor that would, if you were to start drinking alcohol, make you more likely to become an alcoholic rather than just a regular alcohol user. Yeah,
and I mean, I suppose that like I said before, we're using alcohol as an example, but really any addiction can be, I think impulse is a pretty big part of any sort of addiction, whether it's gambling, sex addiction, cocaine, or
I'd be interested to look into that in terms of impulsive behaviors that could be seen to almost be addictive, such as OCD and stuff, where people feel a compulsion to touch wood and stuff. And it'd be quite interesting to see if that's to do with just a general kind of background impulsive, whatever this documentary is suggesting, rather than like a genetic genotype difference that means yes, you have got OCD. I don't know about that. I'd like to look at it. It sounds like a cool way to go.
I think so that's one way of looking at it. I think the key thing to point out though is that with things like addiction, even if if you come from a long family of people who've had drug addictions, and there is evidence to suggest that if you come from a family, I think the statistic for alcoholism is you are 4 times more likely to be an alcoholic if one parent is an alcoholic or something like that. I mean, that's not a perfect example because that's both nature, well, arguably both nature and nurture. I mean, you're growing up in the household with it, and you're also, if the science is to be, if the evidence is to be believed, then you also have maybe a predisposition for it.
Yeah, I mean, there are some more technical biological factors that we can maybe talk about another time to do with how these drugs interact with neurotransmitters and stuff, and they quite clearly could have a genetic proponent, but we can get onto that to another time. What I think would be really interesting now is if we think about some of the ramifications for choosing one way or the other, or too strong a headline on one direction or the other on nature nurture. So sticking with the addiction kind of side of things, I think a really, really interesting thing, which you kind of alluded to, is what the implications are of that, of a person and their duties, and what kind of a person it makes someone to be an alcoholic. There's kind of this stereotype that if you're an alcoholic, it's because you've given up on life and you're a low life.
Mm-hmm. So you're asking from if you were to take an extreme position on the nature-nurture debate with regard to alcoholism. If
you were to see it as either holy nature or holy nurture.
That's a great question. It's like a thought experiment, like you say. So, we could use anything really, but if we use alcoholism, then if you take a purely nature perspective, and this is not, I can preface this by saying it's not scientifically accurate what we're saying. If it was found out that all alcoholics shared this particular gene, and unless, well, I was going to say you'd have to actually have access to it, because imagine if you had somebody who had this alcoholic gene, quote unquote.
Well, for the purposes of this, just imagine we can know everything about them.
Yeah, okay, so you could not, in using the extreme nature position, then if alcoholism is kind of, imprinted, woven into your genetics to the extent that you could not do anything about it, then public opinion would have to change on what being an alcoholic is. It would, in a way, you'd have to treat it like genetic diseases. Like you'd feel bad for this person. You'd be like, oh, it's really unfortunate that they have been landed with this set of genetic traits, and they have really low impulse control. I mean, it wouldn't necessarily just be alcoholism, but like I say, I mean, there is the point that if it's kind of playing with the analogy a little bit, but this person would have to have access to alcohol, because if somebody had this alcoholic gene and you just deprived them of alcohol, then
they would never show
they couldn't
the
be an
behavior
alcoholic
in the first place.
They couldn't be an alcoholic. But I mean, so that's the hardline nature perspective. I think there'd be a lot of sympathy for these people, because they literally couldn't help it. It's not an environmental thing. They can't teach themselves to not be alcoholics, because it's inside them.
Well, what about the other side? Because I mean, obviously, if it's the other way around, if it's like a nurture, or as we started talking about earlier on, like an extension of nurture, the environmental effects, and essentially choice, and like you've gone through the environment and you picked up little keys and developed behaviors and stuff. Obviously, that has a complete different role to if it's biological, because the choices you've made, there'll be things you've done, but not only that, but it also kind of puts the onus on it being a psychological thing rather than a genetic, so therefore treatable through psychological means, by not just abstinence, which would obviously be helpful, which is partly biological, partly psychological, but through like CBT therapy and talk therapy, and
it makes it much less deterministic.
Yeah,
if you come through like the approach I just described, if it's genetic, then all you can really do is be abstinent. That's the only option you got, because you've got this is very
it's quite ultimate as well, though, isn't it? If it's like a biological thing, like you have this thing, if you drink alcohol, you're going to get an addiction, and
then you'll end up drinking yourself to death.
Well, either that, or you're like, well, I can never have alcohol. Or imagine it the other way, if you're addicted and it's entirely, I keep saying psychological, but it's kind of nurture.
Well, environmental works.
That is, psychology is like a discipline of degrees, isn't it? There isn't kind of like point A and point B. There's all the things in the middle. So if you're an addict, there's the potential, well, I can cure myself of my addiction and be able to drink alcohol potentially. Whereas if you have this molecule in your body, you're going to crave more and more and more and more and more. That's like finalist.
It's my understanding that that's AA's philosophy, actually. that you're defective, essentially. That you are. Yeah, it's a nature perspective.
Oh, really?
So yeah, it is. Right. I'll put a link into that.
Yeah.
But it's I mean that's the kind of position they take with the nature nurture debate. But it's interesting how if you fall down on one side or the other, it affects how society would or should look at it. I mean, what's really interesting about it is, and this is kind of linking into the free will debate, is that it's difficult to actually fully pin blame on the individual, whichever position you take. So like I said with the one I just described with the fully genetic basis of alcoholism, the hypothetical, you definitely can't blame the individual there, because
it's down to physics.
I mean, nobody has control over the genetics that they have. So they grow up with this deficiency, this defective situation. It's not their fault. But then if you look at the hardline nurture position and say that nobody has a predisposition for addiction, and instead any addiction that develops in someone's life is purely the result of their environment, it's still really difficult to say that I mean, I suppose that does allow for choices, but even still, still, people are a product of their environment, and we're getting very close to the free will determinism debate.
Which I think is an important thing. Maybe we talked for the last few minutes or so, but it's definitely a thing for another podcast. But the consequence, I mean, we stuck with addiction as being like our kind of test subject for quite a lot of this podcast, so maybe we should stick with that. But if everything is determined either by nature or nurture,
or an
interplay, even more an interplay, it's the kind of questions of blame and stuff don't really matter. Like, it's not so much the kind of focus. It doesn't really matter about that. What's more important is which one of these two ideas, again sticking with addiction, is the most effective at helping the person, isn't it? Yeah. Whether we can cure them or be palliative to it and treat the symptoms or whatever.
I mean, that's like I was saying, if we're going to go down the medication and treatment role, if you accept that it's a purely genetic, if you go down the hypothetical position, like you said, of alcohol being a genetic illness, or a predisposition that cannot be helped, then you can't actually treat that, at least not with, I mean, putting aside the fact that gene editing is becoming, it's starting to come through and become, more advanced. It's an emerging technology, but as it currently stands, if you have this genetic makeup, you have these genes that make you an alcoholic should you touch it, then there's very little you can do.
You just lost the right.
I think all you can do in that point is be abstinent from it. Which is it's precisely the AA. Like I said, it's precisely the AA position. And then the other side of it is much more constructive. The nurture perspective is much more constructive because it's less permanent. It implies that you can actually do something about it. With learning theory, with conditioning, that if you can, with phobias, we know that people can be cured of their phobias. So that in theory, if alcoholism is a result of your environment, then in theory it's possible to unlearn is a strong word, but you can certainly use your environment to your benefit and become less dependent on it. It's much less of a death sentence.
You can essentially use all the information you can gather about yourself as a dictionary to try and find out what is the thing that's caused the problem, and then unravel that.
So really, what's left to do now is to draw it all together and to really come to some sort of solid conclusion about what we...
It's kind of a solid conclusion that to me it's a solid conclusion that there is no real conclusion between which is better, because neither are better.
Well, I mean, I think we've made it pretty clear throughout the course of the podcast that neither one extreme is a perfect explanation of any given thing. So, addiction, certain illnesses, behaviors and traits and these sort of things tend to be a sort of mix between the two, and like we focused on the diathesis stress, so the interplay between genetics and how environments interacts with that. And I think if any of the things that we've talked about, any of the approaches, surely that diathesis stress has got to be
it's closest to the general thought line, isn't it? This interplay between genes and environment. And
I mean, it doesn't really take much. I don't think it takes much thought to really come to that conclusion anyway. I think it's like anybody who's familiar with the study of humans will know that it's very rarely a simple answer, as we said with psychology. So you wouldn't need too much experience to work out that with the nature nurture debate, probably a little bit of each was always going to be the answer, wasn't it?
Cool.
Yeah. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider subscribing.
You can also follow us on Reddit and Twitter.
Thanks for listening.